A lead casting, 4,200 pounds. A hollow keel cavity in East Taunton, Massachusetts. Polyester slurry poured into the voids. Nothing bolts it in place, and nothing ever has. Sailors have spent 40 years calling that the safest keel ever put in a production boat. The accident data says they are measuring the wrong thing. Have you ever put a wrench on a keel bolt you could not actually see the bottom of? Drop it in the comments. This is what Yachts and Boats covers. Subscribe so you do not miss what is next. Start with what is true, because the title of this video is doing some work, and I would rather hand you the correction than have you find it. The hull of a Cape Dory is solid glass, hand-laid, alternating layers of fiberglass mat, and woven roving in polyester resin with no coring anywhere below the waterline. The deck is a different animal. The 25, the 25D, the 30, the 30. Mark II, the 33, and the 36 all carry an end-grain balsa core in the deck and cabin top. Good Old Boat, reviewing the 30 Mark II, says it without softening. On older boats, it is not uncommon for the core to become wet, resulting in delamination. Sound the deck around every fitting, especially the chain plates. Hold on to that word. Chain plates. It comes back at the end of this, and it turns out to be the whole story. So the hull has no core, and it has no keel bolts at all. Practical Sailor, reviewing the line, lays out exactly how Cape Dory did it. Ballast in all cases is a lead casting. The casting sits in a hollow keel molding. The gaps between the casting and the molded shell are filled with polyester slurry, and then the whole assembly is heavily glassed over from inside the hull. There is no joint between hull and keel, because the keel is the hull. No washer plate to pull through. Nothing stainless running up into the bilge for you to watch weep rust every spring the way you have on every other boat you have owned. On the 30 Mark II, that casting weighs 4,200 pounds. The 30 carries a 40% ballast to displacement ratio. The 28 is the one that stops people though. 9,000 pounds of boat on a hull 28 feet and 1 inch long. The company was Cape Dory Yachts. Andy Vavalotis started it in 1963 in a garage in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, building a 10-foot fiberglass dinghy. At the peak, it ran 325 people through a 142,000 square foot factory in East Taunton. Most of the designs came from one man, a Swedish-born naval architect named Carl Alberg. Practical Sailor described what Vavalotis did with them as an almost unswerving loyalty to the long keel with attached rudder. 28 years. More than 2,800 sailboats from 22 to 45 feet, plus over 2,000 typhoons on top of that. Not one keel bolt in any of them. Vavalotis built the hardware himself as well. He was unhappy with what he could buy, so he started a bronze foundry division called Spartan Marine to cast his own ports, cleats, and chainplate lugs. 60 years later, that shop is still running in Georgetown, Maine, and its general manager says he believes they are the only people left in the United States casting this range of bronze deck hardware. Good Old Boat, writing about the 27, makes the argument this entire reputation stands on. The solid hull and the absence of vulnerable keel bolts mean that even in a grounding, damage will most likely not be catastrophic and might only be cosmetic. A Cape Dory 30 owner gave Practical Sailor the version you hear in every anchorage on the eastern seaboard. It is an advantage in an older boat because you never have to worry about aging keel bolts. That argument has one weakness, and it is not in the boat. It is in the premise underneath it. Nobody ever checked it. The claim is that a keel with no bolts cannot come off. There is a database that tracks whether bolts are what makes keels come off in the first place. In 2008, the International Sailing Federation formed a Keel Structure Working Party. Boats were losing keels, people were dying, and nobody anywhere had a list. Not the builders, not the class associations, not one insurer. Keels had been coming off boats for decades, and the sport had no idea how many or why or whether the number was climbing. So they built one, every reported keel failure they could document, going back to 1984. The list came to 72 boats. 24 people died in them. That is the entire evidence base. Everything anyone actually knows about why keels come off a sailboat sits inside 72 rows. In 44.5% of those 72, investigators established an actual cause. 3 were keel bolts, the failure every sailor is taught to fear his whole life. Across 4 decades and 72 lost keels accounted for 3 of them. 3 out of 72. Which bothers you more, that the number is that low, or that nobody who has ever sold you a survey mentioned it? 11 were welded fin failures. 8 came from grounding collisions, 8 from internal structure, and 2 from canting keel systems. Practical Boat Owner put it flatly in December of 2023. The first reaction when a boat loses a keel is to blame the bolts, and the evidence does not support it. On the 16th of May, 2014, a yacht called Cheeky Rafiki was 720 miles east-southeast of Nova Scotia, sailing home from Antigua. She was a Beneteau First 40.7, built in 2006. Around 800 of them were afloat at the time. An ordinary boat, not a prototype, not a stripped-out race boat, the kind of 40-footer sitting in half the marinas in Britain. Her keel came off. She inverted. 4 men went with her: Andrew Bridge, Paul Goslin, Steve Warren, and James Mayle. When the USS Oscar Austin found the upturned hull 7 days later, the life raft was still sitting in its stowage position. Nobody reached it. The Marine Accident Investigation Branch found no keel bolt failure. What they found was a combined effect of previous groundings and subsequent repairs to the keel and the internal matrix, weakening the structure where the keel attached to the hull. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Cheeky Rafiki was operated commercially, which meant she had to meet the Small Commercial Vessel Code, which meant she was inspected more often than any privately owned yacht in the same harbor. She was inspected more than her neighbors, and the keel still came off. 3 years later, on the 7th of December 2017, a Comet 45S named Tiger of London lost her keel off Tenerife and capsized in seconds. 5 people were pulled out of the water. MAIB recovered the stainless steel top plate. The lead sank. It went down in deep water off the Canaries and has never been seen since. Their assessment found the keel had not been built to the designer's drawing. And then came a sentence that matters more than anything else in this video. The condition of the connection cannot be inspected or assessed using traditional survey methods. So the bolts are mostly not the problem, which raises a much harder question about a boat that removed them, because taking a failure point out is not the same as not having one. Start with the part Cape Dory owners never quote. The same Practical Sailor review that documents the encapsulated ballast, in the same paragraph, says this: while the workmanship and materials used in these ballast installations are excellent, we prefer an external, bolted-on lead casting for its shock-absorbing qualities. That is the magazine this audience trusts above every other, choosing the bolted keel. They were never unanimous about the rest of it either. Practical Sailor looked at the hull-to-deck joint, where an inward-turning flange is bonded with thickened polyester and only partly through-bolted, and wanted closely spaced bolts running the whole length of it. Sailing Magazine looked at the same joint on the 36 and argued the reverse, that fasteners set closer together do little for strength and plenty for leaks. 2 respected magazines, 1 flange, no agreement between them. The reason is repair. A bolt-on keel can be dropped off the boat, laid on the ground, fed and rebedded by a yard in a week. An encapsulated keel forces every repair in place, in the cramped space around the cavity, and once water works its way between the glass and the lead, there is no method on earth for drying it out. Sail Magazine adds the part nobody in Florida thinks about. Water that finds the cavity freezes every winter the boat sits ashore, and it works on the laminate from the inside out. A New England fleet, hauled and blocked every October since 1976. Run that arithmetic. Here is what Cape Dory actually built. They took the keel bolts out, and then behind the bronze chain plates holding the entire rig to the boat, they put mild steel. Practical Sailor photographed one. A chainplate backing plate out of a Cape Dory Typhoon trapped under fiberglass that had turned into what the magazine called rusty cornflakes. Steel rusts. Rusting steel expands to somewhere between 4 and 10 times its own volume, and it does that under a deck, behind a bulkhead, in a place where a moisture meter reads nothing and a surveyor has no protocol to follow. On the Cape Dory board, a member describes stepping his mast for the first time. The chain plates popped straight out of the deck. The backing plate had rusted away to nothing, and the bolt had snapped through the middle. The chain plate itself was perfect. On the Cape Dory 36, there is a hull number where this changes. Before hull 71, a mild steel web carried the lower shrouds and the backstay. After 71, an aluminum angle bar glassed to the hull below the deck flange. One number in a production run separates two completely different futures for the same boat. That is the trade nobody printed in the brochure. The failure did not get engineered out of this boat. It moved. It went from a keel bolt you can put a wrench on to a plate you would have to cut the deck open to look at. Which brings me to the man who actually did the thing in the title of this video. Sam Holmes has taken a 1979 Cape Dory 28 to 45 countries, across the Atlantic twice, the North Sea, the Baltic, the Mediterranean, West Africa, and the Caribbean. Now read his refit list. In 2021, he replaced the chain plates with bronze and carbon fiber reinforcement to fix, in his own words, the corroded mild steel backing plates that nearly all Cape Dorys exhibit. Further down the same list, he replaces a rotten section of core under the windlass. The most documented Cape Dory ocean crossing of the last decade was made on a boat where both of the real weak points had already been found and cut out. 72 keel losses, 24 dead, 3 bolts, 1 rusted plate under a typhoon deck. No documented case of a Cape Dory losing its ballast at sea turned up anywhere in this research. That is worth something, and it is not proof because the working parties list records failures without ever recording how many boats of each construction type were out there to fail in the first place. There is no rate. Nobody has ever worked one out. So the honest verdict is that both sides have a story and neither one has the arithmetic. What the record does show is smaller and far more useful. Every way of building a boat moves its weak point somewhere. Cape Dory pushed theirs out of the bilge and up into the deck. Beneteau bonded an internal matrix to the hull and handed the load to that. And MAIB, looking at a keel that killed nobody only because 5 people got lucky off Tenerife, wrote that the connection cannot be assessed using traditional survey methods. The question was never whether your boat has a weak point. It is whether yours sits somewhere a surveyor is allowed to look. Every boat you have ever owned had a spot like this. On most of them, nobody told you where it was because the survey form has no box for it. That is the work this channel does. Subscribe to Yachts and Boats, and the next hull comes apart the same way.